If you're wondering whether or not you can handle the courtroom, then this video right here is for you. Because in this video, I'm going to share with you an example direct examination, which may not sound super exciting, but I am absolutely pumped about this video because if you're getting ready for the courtroom, then this video right here is going to put your knowledge to the test. The question is, are you ready for it? First things first, I want you to be able to get the very most out of this example direct examination. And to do that, I strongly recommend that you watch all of this video. I know, that sounds like a big sales pitch or a sneaky proposition so I can increase my watch time. In reality, the reason why you need to watch this entire video is because you have a homework assignment. And this homework assignment, which may just cause you to X out of this video and move on, but if you're still watching, the homework assignment is for you to spot the evidentiary issues. I really can't stress this enough. If you want to have success as a trial lawyer, if you want to go conquer the courtroom, then you need to be able to spot evidentiary issues. And there's basically two aspects to that, to where you can anticipate evidentiary issues in advance or you can handle evidentiary issues as they arise in the moment. And the reason why you want to prepare in advance is because you want to use the rules of evidence in your motion in limine. And for those that don't know what a motion in limine is, then be sure to check out the video that's sliding above. And as you're preparing your motion in limine, don't forget to anticipate what the other side's motion in limine is going to be. If you can anticipate what those pressure points will be for the other side, those pain points, then you can better craft your response to that motion in limine. Now, I'm willing to bet that this second scenario is what gives you the most anxiety, and that's making your objections on the fly or having to respond to objections in the moment. And that right there requires you to be extremely comfortable with the rules of evidence, with arguing to the court, and with hearing certain buzzwords that kind of cause your ears to perk up to where you know exactly what to say in the moment. I mean, let's just put it this way. The rules of evidence, that's a monster by itself. Public speaking during the middle of a trial, yeah, that's pretty difficult too. Combining the two, ooh, that is a recipe for anxiety. And so I completely sympathize. But fortunately, there's a remedy, and that is practice, practice, practice. It's not a quick and easy remedy, but it's definitely something that can work if you put the time and energy towards it. So I recommend that you watch videos just like this, because as you're watching the direct examination, I challenge you to spot the evidentiary issues and to come up with your objections or come up with the responses to those objections. Now, with this challenge that's out there, I really see only one option for you, which is smashing that like button and hitting subscribe. I see a lot of people doing that on YouTube. I don't know if that actually works or not. If I try and sneak it in there, does that really make you compelled to smash the like button and hit subscribe? I don't know. But if it does, let me know in the comments, then maybe I'll try and sneak it in a little bit more often. Okay, let's get back on track here, because there really are only three options that I can see you take. Option number one, blame option, which is you don't partake in the challenge and you simply maybe just exit out of the video, or you just watch the video for the sake of it. Not too much fun. Option number two is a little bit more fun, especially in comparison to option number one, which is that you do partake in the challenge, but as you're watching the video, you're basically a lurker, to where you're making mental notes of the objections, when you would make the objections, what objections you would make, what responses you would provide if somebody else objects, and basically identify any issues or matters that should be brought up during a motion in limine, or maybe anticipate what the other side's motion in limine would look like, and then also anticipate a response. Option number three is the most fun, comes highly recommended, and has a 5-star review. Granted, there's only one review, but anyways, what you need to do with option number three is essentially call your shot. As you're watching the direct examination, if you feel like an objection needs to be made, then just simply go down in the comment section below and identify the timestamp, make your objection, and I invite anyone who sees an objection being made to respond to that objection accordingly. Or if you want to take maybe a more objective approach, just state which objections should be applied and what your thoughts are on whether or not that objection would survive and whether or not that piece of evidence is admissible. And I also recommend that you identify what matters should probably be brought up during a motion in limine. That way there aren't any issues with the jury hearing things that they maybe shouldn't be hearing at all. This means in order for you to get the most out of this video, I intentionally asked questions that invited inadmissible evidence, inadmissible testimony. So it's your job to spot it. It's your job to identify it. And if anything, it's also your job as the trial lawyer to make sure it doesn't come in. And in that situation, you need to make your objection. You need to call your shot in the comment section down below. Or alternatively, there may be some factors, there may be some testimony, there may be some evidence that's a little bit in that gray area. And since it's not so black and white, it may really depend on the argument itself. In fact, there were situations where I was talking to the witness, AKA, as you'll see, my wife, and her and I both disagreed on whether or not something would be admissible. Again, I invite you to start the conversation down below. Now, before I send you on this treasure hunt, so to speak, I do want to tease you with a little bit of a gold nugget. And that gold nugget, without spoiling anything, is that there is an objection out there that can be made that, in my opinion, if the objection is sustained, would render about 80% of this direct examination and its testimony as inadmissible. And that is a huge thing because you're essentially nuking the entire testimony. And so it's something to be on the lookout for. And I'm curious to see how long it takes somebody to identify it. I'm curious to see if people agree that maybe this should be admissible or inadmissible, or the objection should be sustained, or maybe the objection just isn't legit. And you also have to keep in mind, this is a mock trial problem. So sometimes mock trial problems have issues with itself that maybe sometimes have inadvertent consequences, like rendering 80% of the testimony as inadmissible. But in either event, that doesn't mean we can't nerd out and identify those objections and make those arguments and have those responses. So with that being said, keep those wheels turning. See if you can identify what that one objection is. It's also worth noting that I'm doing a 2-for-1 here by posting this video both on YouTube and Trial Ad Academy. For those that are solely on YouTube, I recommend that you go through the Law Venture channel and you watch the evidentiary videos to get a quick refresher, because most of what you're going to need when it comes to making the objections in this video are out there on the Law Venture channel. And for those that are currently enrolled in Trial Ad Academy, we're gonna take things a step further by breaking everything down piece by piece, by unpacking everything involving not only this example, but future examples as well, to where you can apply the logic, you can apply the tactics, and you can ultimately go kill it on game day. Welcome everyone. My name is Jarrett Stone, as you know, and with me is my lovely wife. She is also a lawyer, and today she's also going to be my witness in this mock trial problem that we're going to be fleshing out. In particular, you're playing Detective Rachel Zane today. Yep. And I may have you play all the parts, and you're going to have to win your Oscar as this goes along. And the point here is, if you can cross-examine your wife successfully, or your significant other, then you're going to be set for trial. But in particular, what we are doing here today is that I'll be playing both roles of the attorney representing the injured party in this case and the attorney representing the defendant. That means I will be doing my direct examination on friendlier terms and then cross-examination on different terms.
Less friendly terms.
Well, yeah, we don't want to get too into it, but who knows where it'll go. So that being said, there's a little bit of a dance that I'll be doing on my end, which is I have one set of notes for the direct, and then since you always want to base your cross on the direct examination, you may see me taking notes of what she said so I could then turn around and use that potentially against you. So yeah, there's a conflict of interest somewhere in here, but that's what we're all set up to do, and we're basically going to try and take this section by section. So whenever you are watching this, you may notice there's some type of abrupt cut at some point. The reason for the section by section is I want you to be able to see maybe the continuous flow of things with each examination, but also see when things are left out in particular. And what I mean by this is, let's say you go to trial, and the morning of your trial, there's the motion in limine that's being presented for both sides. And the court says, okay, this needs to stay out and this needs to stay out as well. And in that situation, it's your job to let your witnesses know in advance, hey, don't talk about this or don't talk about that. And so the goal here is for you to see kind of both sides of things. If a motion in limine isn't brought up, if you don't use your objections as the sword and the shield, how bad that can potentially be. And then you can see the effect of having the sword and the shield in place to where maybe the story isn't nearly as bad. And then we'll kind of break down exactly what was left out, and you'll be able to see, what essentially the argument of what would have kept it in or what should keep it out. And we'll go from there. So my goal is to try and direct you in a way that is going to be clear on how to basically touch and talk about the topics that you would probably end up talking about that would ultimately be admissible, but you may see me put my hand up a little bit if you start kind of going towards that gray area. And me putting my hand up is more of the other side standing up and maybe approaching the bench to say, Your Honor, I think Miss Detective Zane is going to be talking about something that we talked about in motion to limine. I just want to stress yada, yada, yada. So if you see the hand up, that means I'm not being rude or anything. It means I may be trying to give her a quick signal of like, hey, let's not talk about that, which you can always do during your direct examination, is simply put the hand up, and that's just a little bit of an indicator to your witness. And hopefully the goal is during direct, like we talked about, this is the star right here. And so if all eyes are on the star, then the hand going up shouldn't really be very noticeable. Along those lines, you're going to be the jury in this situation. So like I kind of was alluding to, you're going to be hearing almost what the jury should hear and what the jury probably would want to hear, which is the shortened section compared to anything and everything, the whole kitchen sink being presented to the jury. And so my lovely wife here will be directing her testimony to you, and I've given her a little bit of I'll say coaching to the extent that I, basically walk through some of the phrases and terminology she should probably use during direct, nothing too intense. So yeah, with that being said, let's go ahead and dive into the direct examination. So I'm going to start this direct examination by essentially skipping what would normally occur, which is me standing up, looking to the court, saying, Your Honor, at this point in time, plaintiff would like to call Detective Zane to the stand, and then Detective Zane, you're going to be walking into the courtroom all the way up to the witness stand, sit down, she'll get sworn in, exactly, and at that point, that's when the examination begins. I said I'd skip all that, but I kind of walked you through exactly what would happen.
That's what it is, yep.
So with all that being said, let's dive into the direct. Detective Zane, I know we know one another, but can you introduce yourself to the jury, please?
Yes, my name is Detective Rachel Zane.
And what do you do for a living?
I am a detective with the Flagstown Police Department.
And what kind of experience do you have as a detective? In fact, I'll strike that. Before you were a detective, what all were you doing?
I was an officer with the Flagstown Police Department. I began my role with the department in 1985, and then in 1999 I became a detective.
So almost 30 years of experience?
Yes.
More or less?
Yes.
And when did you say you became a detective?
In 1999.
And since then, have you remained being a detective?
Yes.
And what all experience did you have as just a patrol officer?
That was investigating cases similar to the one we're here to talk about today. Car wrecks, different patrol issues that would come up in the city.
And how many car wreck cases did you have experience with?
Approximately 200.
And then as a lead detective?
I have been the lead detective on, I believe, about 25 of those.
And what brings you here today sitting on this witness stand?
I am here so that justice can be served. Basically, I'm not getting compensated. This is part of my job as being the lead detective in the wreck that led to Mr. Pearson's death.
So with that said, let's transition a little bit to exactly what brings us here today. Can you kind of walk me through how you got involved into this entire case?
Yes. So I was on call that evening. Basically what occurred was the night of August 1st, I believe, 2017, we received a phone call that there had been a wreck and that there was a fatality. So at that point in time, I was dispatched to the scene.
Do you remember around what time that was?
I believe it was around 11:30 or so, maybe a little after.
And can you describe the scene whenever you arrived?
It was pretty horrific, probably one of the more gruesome scenes that I've been on as the lead detective. There aren't a ton of car wrecks that happen quite like this, but there were two cars who had a lot of impact. One was flipped over. Obviously, there was a death, so that always makes it a little more intense and a little more scrutiny that comes into play with that type of car wreck.
Was it just you on the scene?
There was a patrol officer who was first to the scene, and then I arrived thereafter.
Were paramedics on the scene?
Yes, there were paramedics already on the scene as well. They were taking Mr. Spector they were preparing to take him to the hospital.
And what was going on, I guess, with the road, so I can kind of visualize it a little bit more? And the reason why I asked, was the road shut down, or were cars still driving? What all was going on?
No, the area was shut down. The car wreck had happened where one car had gone over the median onto the other side, oncoming traffic, so that area, we had to investigate it fully, and we needed everything locked down.
So once you arrived on scene, did you begin your investigation?
Yes. Once I arrived, I spoke with a patrol officer who was first on the scene. At that point in time, I began kind of observing where everyone was, where the vehicles were left, if there was any evidence on the street, and diagrammed that all out so that we would have it for future.
And you were talking about evidence. Can you explain to the jury what evidence you ended up seeing?
Sure. There was a hubcap on the median. There were metal pieces. We didn't know if they were related to the accident at that point in time, but we collected those for evidence and for our technicians to look at. We also had the cars there and the way that they were left after the wreck.
And what was your determination of how things occurred?
Overall, it appeared that the car going northbound had gone over the median into the car moving southbound, which is Mr. Pearson's car, and that impact was what killed Mr. Pearson. Thereafter, the car that was going northbound, Mr. Spector's car, had flipped over and landed on its hood.
Okay, so we're talking about multiple cars in that
Yes.
explanation. So let's take it step by step a little
Sure.
bit. Which car was going northbound?
Mr. Spector's car, the defendant here.
Okay, and walk us through one more time what happened with Mr. Spector's car.
Sure. So Mr. Spector was driving northbound. I believe the street is Hanley Road. And as it was going north, it appears it went over the median into oncoming traffic that was going southbound. So opposite, it impacted Mr. Pearson's car, and then landed on its hood.
And you're talking about Mr. Spector's car?
Yes, yes.
And what kind of car does Mr. Spector drive, or was driving at that time?
So he has a pretty classic car. It's a 1968, I believe, blue Jaguar.
And whenever you, I guess, looked at the aftermath, anything stand out to you?
I mean, the car was in great shape and looked to be in pretty mint condition. It looked like he took care of it, with the exception of the impact that occurred that evening.
Okay. Were you able to conduct any investigation on scene in regards to Mr. Spector?
So Mr. Spector was being airlifted to the hospital at the time. So in regards to him directly, no. But as they were taking him out of the car, I was able to just kind of be nearby when that occurred.
And any evidence or suspicions that started arising whenever you were watching Mr. Spector?
Yes. So when I was close by as they were taking him out of the car to be airlifted, there was a noticeable smell of alcohol coming. It was either from him or his car. That was to be determined.
And did you talk to any witnesses on the scene?
I did. So beyond the patrol officer who had arrived first, there was a witness who was on a nearby cross street and had seen Mr. Spector's car driving that evening.
And did the witness tell you anything?
Yes, he said that it appeared he was driving extremely quickly, fast down Hanley Road.
I hate to cut you off there, but you said he was driving. Are you talking about the witness, or are you talking about Mr. Spector?
Mr. Spector. So the witness observed Mr. Spector driving northbound at an excessive speed, is what he had said.
And did you factor that into your investigation?
Yes, to the extent that there may have been either an emergency or there may have been some other factor contributing to him driving at an excessive speed.
What other factors went into your, investigation?
So the investigation required an extensive view of not only the scene but other contributing factors such as the road conditions, if there was anything in Mr. Spector's car, So something that I noticed on the road and made note of on my documentation was that there was a pothole in the road. It was relatively large. So if there was some kind of emergency and this individual Mr. Spector hit that pothole, could that be a contributing factor to this accident? That was one of the things I was looking for just in my investigation.
And I hate to be just way too cautious, but
Sure.
Can you explain to the jury where exactly the pothole was?
Yes, the pothole was in the left lane on the northbound part of the street. So it was the northbound is how Mr. Spector was driving, northbound, and that pothole was in the left lane.
And based on your investigation, were you able to determine where Mr. Spector was traveling at the time?
Mr. Spector was in the left lane of the northbound road, yes.
Okay, and what else did you end up, uncovering or discovering during your investigation?
Can you be a little more specific?
Well, after looking at the pothole, was there anything else that may have stood out to you?
As far as the scene goes, there was a hubcap on the median and appeared to come from Mr. Spector's car. There were other metal pieces that came from the car, and I believe there were also scuff marks on the median, northbound side of the median.
And when you saw the pieces of metal and all that on, was it Mr. Spector's side?
Yes, the northbound side.
How were you able to determine what was what?
At that point in time, as far as the metal pieces were concerned, we weren't really sure where they came from, if they were relevant at all. So we bagged them, we collected them as evidence, and then we were going to turn them over to our technicians who would determine that.
And just so the jury can be clear, when you say we, who's this we?
The investigation team, myself, the patrol officer. I can't do everything, but I relate to the police department as we.
What happened whenever you left the scene?
So after I left the scene, I created a diagram of everything I've explained to you thus far, where the cars ended up after the wreck, the evidence that was on the street, that information.
And why would you create a diagram like this?
It assists in memory for later. It assists if there's ever insurance involved. Basically, it's to create a document that can show exactly how things were.
So I'm going to do the clacker thing, as in we're breaking character real quick. So in this situation, as of right now, we're going to assume that Exhibit A has already been pre-admitted. But we'll talk about the other exhibits and maybe even this exhibit later on whether or not they should be admitted. But for the sake of keeping this moving relatively quickly, this has been pre-admitted. So now at this point in time, we're going to assume that I asked the judge or the court to allow me to publish the exhibit for the jury to look at while the witness, Detective Zane in this situation, is going through and kind of pointing at things. Since I don't have an Elmo right now, what I'm going to do is just turn my laptop, but I'll try and put the exhibit right here on this general area.
Over your face.
Over here, yeah, where you won't be able to see me, and then you can follow along to see exactly what Detective Zane is pointing at. Detective Zane, what I just handed you is pre-admitted. It's marked as Exhibit A, which the jury can see at this point. Can you walk the jury through exactly the diagram and just explain what we're looking at?
Yes. So, if you look, thank you. If you look on the right side of this diagram, this is the diagram I created after leaving the scene. This street is northbound, as you can see. That is Mr. Spector's car, labeled number 1. You can see the trajectory of his car. He was in the left lane going northbound when he came over the median and hit car number 2. Car number 2 is Mr. Pearson's car. So what you can see here is that, I'm going to go above so it's a little easier. You can see the point of each car is the direction they were going, so it would be the front of their car. Mr. Spector's car came northbound, went into the median. The front of his car went into the driver's side of Mr. Pearson's car, which resulted in his death, and then flipped over. So the hood went in first, and then he flipped over onto the back side, the hood of his car, which is why you see that the nose is now pointing towards the median, and he's on the southbound side of the street.
So, if you don't mind, can
Sure.
you walk the jury through kind of these symbols? I see a PPP and then all these X's.
Yes, so the P's are where the pothole was. As I mentioned before, it was a very large pothole, so the event that it could have contributed to the wreck was something I wanted to make sure we had detailed and documented properly. The X's show where the skid marks into the median were, and also where those metal pieces that I described earlier were located once we got there. Additionally, you see Mr. Pearson's car. The nose of it is pointing southbound. He was driving southbound at the time of impact, and after Mr. Spector's car hit him, he veered off to the right just by Elm Street.
Detective Zane, can you walk the jury through exactly how, and I'll just say that this is the second rendition of Mr. Spector's car, how it goes from here to this third rendition of Mr. Spector's car?
So in order for that to occur, in my experience and my professional opinion, the car had to be moving at an extremely high rate of speed, and there had to have been some level of loss of control, basically.
So after you left the scene and you created this diagram, what did you do next?
So after that, I went to the hospital where Mr. Spector was being treated, and I asked that the medical team there do a blood draw.
And why did you ask for that?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, when I observed Mr. Spector being taken out of his car and airlifted to the hospital, I noticed a smell of alcohol. I, at the time, wasn't sure if it was coming from the car or Mr. Spector himself. So if that was a contributing factor, we needed proper documentation of that.
So can you kind of walk me through what the blood draw ends up doing, what that ends up proving?
Yes, so the blood draw shows what the blood alcohol content level was at the time of the blood draw.
And what were the results in this situation?
So the results here were around 1:15 in the morning following the wreck. There was Mr. Spector's blood draw showed that he had a 0.06 of alcohol in his system.
Okay, those are a lot of numbers.
Yes.
Can you kind of explain to the jury what it all means and maybe simplify it a little bit? That way we can figure out exactly what the results were.
Yes, so 0.08 is considered presumed intoxicated. That is the legal limit in our state. Therefore, with a 0.06, approximately 2 hours after the accident, I was able to infer that Mr. Spector was likely a BAC of 0.08, potentially even higher, 2 hours earlier when the wreck occurred.
And did this result go into your determination and your ultimate conclusion given the investigation?
Yes, it did.
You talked about where Mr. Spector was headed. He was going to the hospital. Where did his vehicle go?
His vehicle went to the impound lot.
And did you investigate the vehicle at that point?
Once it was in the impound lot, yes, I did.
What all did you find?
So mostly it was pretty typical things you would find in a car. There were two unusual items, if I remember correctly. One was a broken beer bottle in the back seat of the car, and the other item was a napkin that looked like it had come from a nearby bar.
And do you know what that bar is called?
I believe it's called Point After Pub.
So after taking a look at the napkin, what did you do?
Well, the napkin obviously showed that Mr. Spector could have potentially been at that bar prior to the accident. So I went to that bar to see if there were any witnesses.
And were there any witnesses?
Yes, there was. A woman named Donna Paulson was there, and I was able to speak with her about Mr. Spector's bar tab that evening, what time he left, what time he arrived, kind of what he was acting like at the bar.
And what all did Miss Paulson tell you?
So essentially, she informed me that Mr. Spector had arrived at approximately 7:30, if I remember correctly, and she indicated that he had been there with a bunch of friends, he ordered some food for everyone, and he ordered drinks for everyone, and then he left around 11:15.
Did you ever talk to Mr. Spector?
Yes, I did. I returned to the hospital after he had undergone his initial treatment to speak with him about the events that occurred prior to the wreck.
And how did that go?
It was definitely a different situation than I've experienced in the past. We spoke about his vehicle, mostly his vehicle. Actually, he was very concerned that his car was damaged. And the odd thing about that is that somebody had died here, and his focus was on his car.
And what did you learn about his car?
So he, as I suspected, takes pretty good care of it generally. He has it worked on at Mike's garage and body shop, and he's very particular about who works on his car, make sure it's kept in good condition, that kind of thing.
So after you were given that information, did you ever visit Mike's garage?
Yes, I did.
And what all did you learn?
Well, as I suspected, and based on my conversation with Mr. Spector, I learned from the owner that Mr. Spector is very particular about who works on his car, when it's worked on, how it's worked on. He basically treats that car like a child of his.
And I hate to do this to you because it is called Mike's Garage, but who's the owner?
Mike.
And at this point in time, whenever you did go visit Mike's garage, where was Mr. Spector's car located?
So eventually his car was released from the impound lot and was brought to Mike's garage to be worked on.
At any point in time, did you and or your technicians take a look at the vehicle while it was at Mike's garage?
Eventually, we were there with the vehicle, and we looked at a certain piece of the car that may have contributed to the wreck.
And what piece was that?
They had asked us to look at the tie rod.
And what is a tie rod?
The tie rod is a mechanism that connects your steering to, I believe it's your axle, so it helps you with steering.
And what conclusions, determinations did you reach?
Basically, the way that tie rod, I keep calling it a tie rod, I'm sorry, tie rod looked was that it was broken, first of all, and it was either broken from being cut or it potentially just could have broken of its own wear and tear. However, it did appear that there were scratch marks that were consistent with it being cut.
And what kind of condition was the tie rod in?
It was broken at that time.
Okay. Was it in good condition overall, or was it in poor condition? What all were you able to determine?
Well, that tie rod, I'm not sure I can answer that one way or another, because the main point and focus of the tie rod was that it was broken. It had been potentially cut down to be broken. So I would say it was not kept in good condition.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think a very important factor of this is that we really don't know whether that came from Mr. Spector's car or not.
The tie rod?
Correct.
And were you able to determine, even if the tie rod was part of Mr. Spector's car, if that tie rod would have broken before, during, or after the wreck?
No, we were not able to determine that conclusively.
So why are we talking specifically about a tie rod?
Well, we were asked to go back to Mike's garage and evaluate whether or not a tie rod was potentially the cause of the wreck.
Who asked you to investigate the tie rod?
Mr. Spector's attorneys later on in our investigation, pretty far down the road, had come to us with this alternative theory and asked us to go to the garage look at this certain piece of car equipment.
Just so I'm clear, you say later on. Walk me through the general timeline.
General timeline was car wreck happened. We did our initial investigation and determined that Mr. Spector was drunk. That was the cause of the wreck. And later on, sometime thereafter, I don't have the exact date, Mr. Spector's attorneys came to us and said, no, this is the real cause. This tie rod broke and made Mr. Spector's car drive off the road, essentially.
Were there any other factors that went into your investigation and ultimately contributing to your conclusion?
Yes. So you can't look at a car wreck like this just from a tiny scope, right? You need to look at any events that could have been contributing to Mr. Spector's behavior, him going out and getting drunk. Was there a reason behind that? And basically what we figured out was that he had recently separated from his wife. He had lost his job at a prominent firm, and he was acting recklessly, which led to this kind of partying behavior, which led to the drinking, to the car wreck, to Mr. Pearson's death.
Given that you're in law enforcement, do you know if any criminal charges have been brought against the defendant?
Yes, there have been criminal charges brought, and the main one obviously here is vehicular manslaughter.
And what's the status of that charge?
It is still pending.
Detective Zane, given your experience, given your testimony, and your entire investigation, what is the conclusion you have for the jury that caused this wreck?
So my professional opinion is that when you look at it, not from a tiny scope, but when you look at everything, all of the evidence presented, Mr. Spector was driving while intoxicated. He likely hit the pothole, lost control of his car, and eventually hit Mr. Pearson's car, which caused his death.
Now, you mentioned the pothole. How does that factor into your equation?
Well, had Mr. Spector been driving at a reasonable rate of speed, or had he not been driving while intoxicated, he likely could have avoided that pothole.
What potentially would have happened had he avoided the pothole?
Well, he wouldn't have lost control of the car, and even if he had hit the pothole and his tie rod had broken at that point in time, he would have been able to gain control or slow down, react more appropriately, and avoid this entire wreck.
And at that point in time, you stand up and you tell the judge that you're going to pass the witness. In other words, you stand up and you go, pass the witness. And then it's time for cross-examination. So I need to put on my cross-examination thinking cap and get ready.
Ready to...
That's exactly right.